And so with that, I'm going to transition us to our first case study. The first case study we're going to hear from is from Sydney Shibata. Sydney joined Khan Academy in 2019, and he leads our team in Latin America, so our teams in Brazil and in Peru. So Sydney, I'm going to call you up. It's all you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you, Rachel. So here we are. Thank you for having me. I'm Sydney, and I'm the Manager Director for Latam. And I'm based out of Brazil and the city of São Paulo. And my pleasure here to be really to see what we are doing in Khan Academy outside of the US, right? So my goal today is to give a quick glimpse of what we are doing in Latin America and give you a few examples of what are the implementations that we are doing in Brazil and Peru. And later, in the end, I'm also going to share what we're looking in terms of next steps for the organization in the region. I'm going to try to make it this as conversational as possible, so in the end, probably going to be able to have some questions and answers. But the story goes like, what is Latin America? And we have around 33 countries in Latin America. And we have then operations since 2018 in Brazil and Peru. We have a team of 7 people right now. And as you may know, most of the countries, right, they speak Spanish. Only Brazil speaks Portuguese, right? So we are talking about 670 million people, and almost 200 million speaks Portuguese, 200 million speaks Spanish. We have maybe one country speaking French, others speaking Dutch, but mostly Spanish, right? And the reason why we don't have advocates is because we have a single language that crosses all the countries, Spanish. And then we have Portuguese for Brazil, for the students that are there as well. Looking back at our PISA results, right? We had this conversation early on about PISA results, and sadly, both countries are the bottom performers, right? We are in what we call like the lower segment of the PISA results. And although we had very interesting, let's say, progress in reading, science, in both countries, right? And even when you compare that to the OECD averages, in math is where we have a lot of opportunities, because as part of the pandemic, we also saw a lot of impact in unfinished learnings in math. So we're gonna see that both in Brazil to the left and in Peru to the right, we had a decline between 2018 and 2022, right? So that's where we actually can help a lot, because our platform can really address unfinished learnings, and that's what we're gonna see in the next slides. So let's then talk a little bit about Brazil, okay? Brazil is a very, let's say, it is a large country, right? We have over 211 million people today. And if you look at the population of students from elementary to high school, we have around 34 million students. And you're gonna see that students are actually divided in 3 or 4 segments, right? We're gonna have the private, city districts, state districts, and federal ones. And the state districts, 40% of the students are the ones where you're gonna get a lot of our focus in district partnerships. Most of the students will be there, right? Most of the 180,000 schools are in city districts, but the majority of students will be in state districts, right? So we have 27 states and more than 5,500 cities. So you're gonna see that we learned with smaller city districts, but then migrated to larger states later on. And states are also more, let's say, more convenient, I would say, even more interesting to work with, because they have more structure, more infrastructure for internet connectivity, devices, access as well. And when you look at our status in terms of infrastructure, right, this is what you're gonna see, the status for schools with internet on a city basis, right? So this is still a challenge for a country like Brazil, right? We don't have, let's say, internet and devices for every student, but the situation is much better after the pandemic. Perhaps one of the few things that we got as a positive outcome from the pandemic is that many districts administrators are actually more inclined to put resources on internet devices, so everyone can actually have access to that. Brazil was one of the countries with the longest school closure periods in the world, and we saw that students couldn't have access to computers or internet at homes. So right now, schools are a key, let's say, resource, a hub for them to get them connected again. And if you look at the distribution of students by cities, right, that's what you're going to see in the bars here. You're going to realize that most of the states, the dark bars there, are the ones above, let's say, 50,000 students, are the ones that are the large districts that are trying to address right now. So we have a few with more than 1 million students. Most of the work that we did in the beginning was really with the smaller cities, like to the left, to the right. That's kind of a long tail kind of situation, right? So we started working with them. We learned a little bit how to operate with a city district. And since 2022, right, right after the pandemic, we started working with state districts. We were able to actually get lessons from our implementations in India, in the US, and we started applying with what would be really the case for the state districts in Brazil. And eventually, in last year, oh, hold on. Something went wrong. Okay. Last year was really the year in which we started getting into a scalable operation, right? We started the year with a, let's say, in March, we had one state, PR, which actually means Paraná. PR actually was one of the states that joined Khan Academy's partnerships with almost 500,000 students. We had that pilot in 2022 with less than 10,000 students. And then we were able to pilot that successfully. And then last year, we were able to actually gain access to 5 grades from 8th to the 12th grade. They're using Khan Academy once per week. And in the second half of the year, we got another state, SP stands for São Paulo, and we had a pilot of over 1 million students, right? And we were able to actually to get them to use Khan Academy in 4 grades as well. And what was interesting is that we had a very large increase in terms of reach, right? When we think about MAUs, which stands for monthly active learners, we had an increase of almost 36 times compared to 2022. But one thing that actually we are getting to maybe this year is really into the engagement challenge, right? Because we're able to, let's say, grow our reach. But now we have to actually engage students more and more. And that's our work when you think about district partnerships. We want to get them to use Khan Academy in a deeply way so that can be really meaningful in terms of impact. This is kind of a busy chart, but I'm just going to give you a sense. When you think about all the districts that we want to work with, right, you're going to see that we have like a few, 36 above 100K. And perhaps another one, which we call the median districts, between 10K and 100,000 students. So we are trying to kind of tailor this in stages. Our focus right now is really on the large districts. We have a few small districts based on our initial years, and we are trying to serve them through communities of learning. But our work is going to be really concentrated on how to work with large districts, right? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But what we can actually get from this chart is this, right? Small implementations really work for you to learn, right? But if you really want to get into scale, you have to pilot with very large districts. And this is a roadmap that takes time, right? It's going to take 2-3 years. It is a worthwhile path to take, but you have to be willing to pilot this so that you can actually get into a size that can bring scale to the operation. So this is one example of one of the states that we've been working since 2022. This is the state of Paraná, the one that I mentioned to you before. And what is interesting here is that this is the weekly usage as measured by time, learning time. You have to remember from even what Rachel said before, right? What we're trying to get is really learning time that is above 30 minutes per week, right? So what you're going to see here, this is the red dotted line there. The interesting thing is that we are still not there yet for the state, right? Because it's really hard to bring systemic habits for the schools and districts and teachers to gain 30 minutes per week. But the thing that is positive here is that it can be achieved if you have consistency of usage first. And that's what we're showing here, right? Every single week we're going to get consistent usage of Khan Academy because they are using Khan Academy in 1 out of 5 classes of math, and we are helping them to bring that closer to the teachers through curation of content, right? Bringing them training, making sure that they are able to get them as close as possible to their weekly plans. And that's what's going on right now. But even if we don't achieve the 30 minutes per week, what we realize is that learning is happening, right? The bottom chart is what we call the skills to proficient, let's say, measure. In our master-based learning, we can keep track of how many skills you progress. And we are quite in line with our expectation, between 1 or 2 skills progressed to proficient per week. That's what we want to achieve. That's what we really want to make sure that impact's happening and students are learning, right? This is the pilot that I mentioned to you before, the 1.3 million pilot. What is interesting about this is a very large state district with over 3.5 million students. And the curious thing is that they've been working with maybe 7 to 10 platforms since the pandemic. And the way that they're doing this is quite impressive. This is just a snapshot of their own dashboard. It is a dashboard that they keep track. It is in Portuguese, but it's just going to give you a sense of what you would find there. You find registered users, learning time, questions that each student is answering each week, and also what is the percentage of right questions that are getting, right? So what is interesting about this is a district-owned dashboard. They're able to draw this based on their own resources, but they have this by region, by school, by teacher. So in a way, that's a powerful tool for them to actually monitor and assess how Khan Academy is doing in terms of an educational platform. So this ends our quick summary about Brazil, right? If you think about Peru, Peru is a different story because Peru is a mid-sized country, at least for Latin American standards, right? We have less than 10 million students. Around, let's say, in a 33 million population country. And interestingly enough, 75% of the public students are in public schools, right? A recent trend that we've been observing is that the private schools are in the rise since the pandemic, and not only because of quality, but also because of security concerns from parents. So that's why you're going to see that, at least in Peru, even when you look into the infrastructure, right, 55% is the average for all regions in Peru to have internet, but most of the internet usage is for administrative purposes, right? And when you look into what you really need, which is internet for students in a classroom or in an IT lab for assessment exercises, this is very low. So this has been our experience as well when we are working with public districts in Lima, Peru's capital. We see that everything that we do has to pivot on available infrastructure. We cannot do that everywhere that we want because there are always limitations for internet and devices and everything else. But that's why one of the reasons we started doing in Peru something else. In Peru, we do work with private universities and also with private schools. Okay, in Lima, 50% of the students are in private schools, right? It's a very high number, right? And this is a low-income private schools. When I think about low income, we're talking about a school that charges $100, $150 per month, right? This is quite okay in terms of what you would pay for a private school in Peru. And the work university is interesting because the first 2 years, they see a lot of dropout because of the lack of, let's say, fully completed curriculum during the basic years, right, for education. They're using Khan Academy to actually keep the retention or try to revert the trend in higher retention, revert the dropout rates that are happening in the last years. And in case of private schools, what we see is that they're actually trying to use platforms to close the gap and making sure that they can actually go to college, universities with a better, a solid education base. Innova Schools is a kind of example for us. They have 15,000 students. You cannot see quite well there, but let me see if but I can show it. There, in the first chart to the upper left, is how many students are active. So out of 15,000, they have 14,000 that are active. And out of this 14,000, 13,000 achieve the status of very active learners, meaning that they have more than 30 minutes per week. This is very high. 90% of, let's say, what we call very active, let's say, conversion is really high, including, perhaps this is the benchmark for Khan Academy worldwide. And this can be seen by the average learning time per student that we see each year, right? Since 2020, we see like a steady growth because they use Khan Academy as part of their curriculum. They also use Khan Academy in a way that we've curated content for them, and they use that as part of regular classes. But one thing that they do that is quite interesting is what they call solo learning, right? Solo learning is an additional time for them to work with Khan Academy. Not only they have like weekly classes at Khan Academy, but they also have this situation in which we have like 2 classes, so 60 students in a single class, and they are divided in 10 groups of 6 students each. Teachers are there just for guidance or for login purposes, for anything that is more technical, but they are encouraged to actually study on their own, right? So you might even have, let's say, we have different students with different levels. And when we went there to visit them, they would even give bracelets for students that were masters in that particular skill. So they would actually have some sort of peer support that was quite interesting. So we don't have a very large footprint in public schools in Peru yet, but this is a good example of how we actually can leverage Khan Academy's usage when the conditions are met, right? We have infrastructure, devices, IT labs, teachers that are involved in everything else. So this is also the summary of what we are doing in Peru. I also want to share what we are thinking for the future, right, in terms of our outlook. And I have 4 things that I would like to share with you. And the first one is basically what we saw with Sal and some of the participants in prior panels. We're still exploring this 2 sigma problem, or 2 sigma opportunity, as Sal stated in one of the TED Talks, right? As I said before, Bloom, this US psychologist, who's deemed to be the author of the taxonomy for education, he said this thing that was quite curious, that the average of instruction based on tutoring and mastery-based learning, the average student in this type of instruction has a grade that is better than 98% of students in the traditional class. So that has been our kind of a goal, right? If we think about technology and how we can use technology to achieve that, we've been working on mastery, which actually alone already brings a very sizable impact. The average student with mastery-based learning is better than 84% of a traditional class. So that makes a lot of sense that we have that in our platform. And we've been trying to get this with implementation of Khan Academy in the districts. And we are going to do the same with Camigo, right? Camigo could be a good, let's say, complement for that, because we will have then this dual approach, not only having mastery-based learning, but also tutoring in a scale that is economically feasible, right? Tutoring is just for the aristocracy, right? Because we don't have conditions to put that kind of instruction for every single student in a public school. So we're going to pursue that with our implementation with districts. This is the mastery mechanics that we have in our platform. And we have ways of kind of fragmenting or, let's say, organizing knowledge in skills. And because of our mastery-based learning approach, we can actually measure when a skill is attempted and when it's mastered. So whenever we actually measure this, right, we are measuring, let's say, it is a proxy measure of learning, right? And when you do that, we are able to see that what we are having in terms of practice is translating into learning. You don't have to wait for assessment exams every 2 years from a national exam or every quarter, if that's the policy for the district. But this is much easier, let's say. I mean, I would say that it is easy to explain, but very difficult to practice, right? So for the districts, what we are thinking is we're probably going to get maybe the second or third year to make them understand how to use this skills funnel to make sure that we have really an intervention in a district that's making difference for the learners of the students. So this is something that we are always have in our mind in terms of the second year implementation, and that's the stage that we are right now in Brazil, trying to make sure that district leaders know how to read this data, right? How to work with additional set of metrics related to skills. We've been working with districts for a long time now, and we also have some pillars that we have to continuously refine. These are the things that we're trying in Latin America in the last 5 years. Content, basically, most of the students come to our platform because of the content, right? But they stick with it because of our mastery-based learning approach. And we are trying to curate learning, not only making sure that we are adherent to national curriculum, but also making sure that it is relevant and easier to access by teachers. Trainings is a key point, as we saw in some of the panels. We need to make sure that everything that we do is really available for teachers and that's well understood by them. Reports and insights, right? We are a technology platform, so we have so many touch points with the students and teachers' experience. If we're able to translate that into metrics that are meaningful for us, that can also help a lot on how we drive implementation districts. Support. Basically, when we have support, you are actually trying to make sure that everyone understands what each tool or each resource is actually meant for students and teachers and districts. And lastly, we also support project management, right? This is a program. It could last 1, 2, 3 years, but you have to make sure that it is properly monitored and we can assess the results, right? So in a way that anything that we identify, be it benchmarks or outliers, we can actually replicate those. And as I said before, if you're able to pinpoint an example of a school, of a teacher that is doing very well, it is easier for others to follow. And we need to have data and need to have monitoring to make sure that those are identified and, let's say, emulated as well, right? And lastly, what we are thinking for the next year is trying to be more sustainable, right? We are a nonprofit. So if you think about 2023, we had only 2 types of teacher-directed students. What I mean by that is students that are using the platform mediated by a teacher. Right? It's not an independent student. It's not someone that is just going there out of sheer curiosity or self-motivation. These are students that are actually learning through Khan Academy because the teacher is actually mediating that experience, right? So right now, we just have 2 types, organic teachers, organic students. There are teachers that are using on their own. There will be the innovators and the early adopters. And when you think about the next years, what we're trying to do is basically bring in products or offerings for districts, and even ones that could be paid for. So what we're trying to do in the region is diversifying of mix of sources of funds, right? So we rely a lot on philanthropy. That's what we've been doing so far. But next year, we're trying to get additional revenue coming from paid offerings, be it for KAD, which is Khan Academy for Districts, or even Camigo, right? And that has been said, that's the overview that I have for you for Latin America. What you saw here is that we are in a, I would say, in a trajectory of gain scale. And as we gain scale, we gain more relevance for public administration. We can get more resources. We can also get more funds. And the idea is that we can start doing this, and we can keep doing this, so that what we do can really reach a scale that can be meaningful for the countries, right? We're talking about here maybe a scale that could be in the house of millions or maybe more than 10 million students that we need to reach. And that's the path that we are setting for us. And it's just interesting that we can share some of these experiences here, but we will be here the next day or so to talk more. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sydney. Before we let you leave, we have time for a question. If anyone has any questions for Sydney. Yes.
Thank you. So for students who are underperforming, or say in the bottom quartile or bottom third, what do you see their progress is with these Khan Academy tools? How does it differ from the other students?
Do you have another mic up there, or do you need this?
Let me see if it's working. Working? Oh, that's good. Mm-hmm. So just to restate the question, you're asking if the progress that we see for students that are in the low quartile of performance is the same, or is comparable to the ones that are in the higher quartile. Is that right?
Yeah, the bottom third, bottom quartile in terms of performance. How is their progress with using Khan Academy?
Yeah, maybe there are two answers to that, right? When you do efficacy studies, right, it's difficult for us to identify exactly which segment the student is does belong to, right? I think that's part of what we are doing in terms of efficacy, let's say investigations. We're going to do that mostly for Camigo right now. On average, that's what the results that we saw before are the ones that we see. But the second part of the question is really, the answer could be that when you look into the schools that we've been working in Brazil, typically what you're going to see is that the performance is actually very consistent when you look into what we hear from teachers or even students in public schools. Once you gain actually give access in IT lab for Khan Academy, for instance, the fact that you can actually go back and really see things that are very basic and that are not covered yet, if the teacher is able to assign that gap that the student has, I think part of the trajectory can be resumed. So maybe it's when we look into the impact of digital tutoring from Camigo, that kind of answer would be clearer, because one thing that we always hear is that you're going to see always gains from students that were already the best ones. But at least from our practice, we see that it's actually very consistent in all quartiles of students.
Great. Thank you, Sydney.